Well, hello there everyone! Ender Magnolia is the sequel to Ender Lilies, one of my personal favorite Metroidvanias, so seeing a sequel be announced earlier this year was nice. The game has had an early access release with a healthy roster of 7 different bosses to cover, and unlike Ender Lilies, I will be counting the minor bosses because there's far fewer of them, there's like 3 instead of 15 or something. And they actually do feel like genuine boss fights this time around instead of just regular enemies with slightly reskinned designs and a bloated health bar. That's it for the intro. I don't feel like stalling it out anymore. This is just the early access version of the game after all. So let's get started with the worst of the bunch appearing all the way down in the decent tier. What? Number 7, the Magicite Mining Captain. I was honestly expecting to be a lot harsher for this fight, especially going off my memory because I remember him being kind of annoying, but in my most recent playthrough, it was actually quite fun to face off against him as he's a lot more mobile than I remember, while still focusing on his gunfire, firebombs, and shotgun blasts. And while his appearance is by no means my favorite, I can appreciate how he has the red armor and like more mechanical look to him, in contrast to a lot of the other bosses sporting often either brown or a black appearance. It's still a one-phase boss fight though that is more or less an evolved version of regular enemies. However, those enemies were strong enough to be small boss monsters on their own, so overall it's not a bad fight. And if this is what the bottom of the barrel for this game's bosses is going to be, I think we can safely say this is a very well-made barrel using good materials. I'll take a fight against this guy over Muriel or Onir any day of the week. As for his story, there's really not much to say for him being a mini-boss, but we do see him regain his senses and he does head back to town, now living as a guard and having found a new meaning in his life, so that's kind of neat. Nothing too much else to say there. He's inoffensive, he's not amazing, but he's not terrible by any means. Number 6, the Steeple Executioner. The second worst boss in the game is already in the good tier. Huh. This guy's fighting style kind of reminds me of the Grade Warden duelists from Elden Ring, and with him having an axe on a chain, it especially is apparent. Though in this case, the chain end is more of a lantern that he'll fling out to launch fireballs around, and due to the lingering fire, it does require you be mindful of your positioning because this game may not have contact damage, thank the Lord. But fire is indeed hot, and burn status can kill you all on its own if you don't have a ribbon equipped or a lot of healing to spare, which at this point you've only got 3 heals, max. The one major strike against this boss though is that it's too easy to just range camp him out with Yolvan and Moomin taking pot shots at him because while he does have his axe to fight you, he doesn't really try to close the distance at all until he gets low on health, and there's nothing really to talk about with him story-wise. He's just there, and when you beat him, he dies. And unless you're paying close attention to his design, he'll really just seem like a regular enemy until you approach him and the boss music starts playing, which I guess could be a surprise, and it's not a bad fight, but one of the more unremarkable ones, but it's a mini-boss, so hey, I'll take it. It's still good, and it's still fun. Number 5, the Child Test Subject. His friends call him Lido. While I do believe Ender Magnolia has a better boss roster overall, I don't think Lido holds up quite as well as an introductory boss as Secret does, as all he really has are some basic punches and a superhero landing which causes an ice AoE during his first phase, and his second phase doesn't add too much crazy stuff either. His second phase only really adds one new attack, and that's where he'll perform a Shoryuken that later has a flame pillar follow-up around him that does look cool, but it's pretty easy to dodge, though hey, it's still a relatively fun boss fight, and the music is great, sounding very industrial and kind of setting the tone for players of this game to let them know things are going to be different from Ender Lilies. There's also some pretty good story here as he's one of the major bosses. Lido was one of the many children taken and experimented on in order to make a new and stronger version of the homunculi, and having some connection to Lilac, though as of right now it's unknown what that connection is or how much time has passed, but Lido appears to be the only survivor, or at least the only one that still has his humanity intact, as the others are either dead or turned into those weird corpse things that we've seen along the way. It's a good introduction, it just doesn't quite live up to the bosses that follow due to its lack of build variety, and, well, he doesn't really have the complexity of a boss design himself like Sigrid does to carry him. Number 4, the Old Upper Stratum Guard. Out of the mini-bosses, I would say the Old Guard is the best of the bunch by a comfortable margin, sporting the largest moveset between various swings of his mace, his shockwaves, his shield bash, etc. His health is a little low for my taste, but it's offset by the fact that he doesn't take direct damage, which is because he uses a giant shield to block it, meaning you either need to find a way to get behind him, attack over his head, or hit him when he's trying to attack you. It kind of reminds me of the Julius fight from Ender Lilies, and hey, he was my favorite boss in that game, so if you're gonna reuse a boss design idea, reusing what's good isn't a bad choice. Plus, while not one of the major story bosses, he does still have some story going for him. He was one of the upper stratum homunculi that was tasked with protecting a pair of young siblings. After an unknown disaster occurred, all of them fell to the lower stratum. While the young boy ended up in the village, he couldn't find his little sister. The Old Guard was unfortunately succumbing to the fumes and beginning to go berserk. So the little girl is trying to find her brother and a way to fix the Old Guard himself. Surprisingly, when you end up getting there after getting a request from the brother to find his little sister, the girl's still alive, which is interesting. And after we defeat him, we're able to cleanse his mind, and he offers us his thanks, as well as a upgrade that lets us get the axe, which is cool. But he's still very much going to die, and instead he makes a promise to the little girl to safely return her to the old city as his final objective. When you get back to the city, you can actually speak to the little girl, and she'll tell you that shortly after she got here, he left telling her not to follow him, and was never seen or heard from again. He more than likely went off to die. Whether he took his own life or succumbed to his wounds is unknown. Perhaps we'll find his body in the full release, or maybe a zombified corpse is a boss rematch. Honestly though, if this guy had more HP and maybe a slight move tweak for a second phase, he could have easily passed as a major boss. And that makes him this game's best mini-boss, at least in my opinion. Number 3, Garm the Giant Gravedigger. At the end of the Magicite Mines, you'll come across Garm the Giant Gravedigger, widely considered to be the toughest boss in the early access version of the game, and while I'm not sure if I wholly agree, he's definitely in the top 2. Regardless, he's split across 3 phases, but he really should have just been a 2-phase boss fight because all he does in phase 1 is stab the ground or kick you. Phase 2 is more interesting, as he can now go for his leaping attacks to send out shockwaves or use his jackhammer to fling rocks up in the air, on top of the already existing ground stabs and kicks in his phase 1 moveset. Then, after one intense roar, you'll reach the final phase where he starts adding in tornadoes to his attacks so you can't take the same openings that you had before, and he'll start flinging out rocks, which make it where you have to be careful when going in for an attack because they do a lot of damage. As for the boss theme itself, it's good, but I don't really like it as much as the other major boss themes in the game. It's a great track when you're listening to it on your phone, but it's pretty hard to hear over the sound of all the fighting going on because for some reason they decided to give one of the most chaotic fights in the game the quietest boss theme. As for the story, Garm's is fairly simple. He's a gravedigger, and he was digging graves for his friends. While he wasn't super intelligent as a person, he did his best to remember the advice that a young woman gave him, which was, when in doubt, look for the flowers, as they remained untainted, and started wearing them as a necklace to protect himself from the fumes. He's a simple man that wanted to protect his friends. Overall, he is a good boss, but I wouldn't say he's amazing tier material like the top 2. Number 2, Yolvan the Black-Winged Huntsman. Probably the most involved boss in terms of the story, Yolvan was one of the Milius test subjects and was a homunculi that, after being found by the young woman, decided to begin protecting the lower stratum, as well as being a parental figure to Levi and her sister, though after her sister went missing, he vowed to protect Levi as her only family left. When we meet Levi, she tells us about Yolvan, but notes that she hasn't seen him for a couple of days, and when we get to town, the blacksmith tells us that another tuner came through town recently, and Yolvan had gone off shortly after. When we find him, he's in the process of succumbing to the fumes, and we have ourselves our first boss fight. The first phase of this battle is pretty straightforward. All he's really going to do is fly around and shoot at you with his guns, which could be annoying, but thankfully we now have Leto on our side, and with Leto's range and the relic that boosts your damage in the air, it's not as bad as you'd think. especially because Lito's punch can burn the enemies, and this works on boss fights as well. And on top of that, despite the fact that he's just shooting his guns, you can tell what attack he's going for based off of the audio telegraphs, which I do like, though the real shakeup happens once you take out his first health bar. Yolvan mutates into the Caladrius, doing away with his guns and instead going for primal slams and sweeps with his claws, as well as using energy spheres as an attack to create some distance with you and bring the fight back to a neutral state. Due to his position early in the game, you're still fairly limited in the fight, but you have both Nola and Lito for combat, so it's not as much as it was against the first boss fight, and Yolvan actually does have the complexity to pull his own weight. He has the most distinct phases in the entire game, for better or for worse, and this is probably the most Ender Lilies of the boss fights in this game, though I think that's mostly for the better, especially due to the fact that this game doesn't have contact damage. Thank the Lord! Also, this fight is just visually really awesome, and seeing the destroyed clock tower in the background as well as the city itself in ruins really does set things up, and this guy could have been the final boss of the early access had they decided to tweak his stats some. Number 1, the Shackled Beast. The best fight in this game in my opinion, and maybe the toughest of them as well, on top of having the most beautiful boss arena. Now, in Ender Lilies, the early access capped off with a relatively underwhelming fight against Elaine, while here we have a fight against the cigarette-smoking Kratos. This is probably the most fast-paced fight in the game because he's going to be going all out and all around the arena, using his chains in order to attack you in phase 1. He'll mostly swing his chains around, either around his body to make you stay back, but if you're good, you can weave in between the attacks to take pot shots against him, and sometimes he'll go for an overhead slam if you're out of range, or he'll go for a thrust with the chains. Then you get to phase 2 where he becomes a lot more aggressive as he'll start charging directly at you, as well as having an upwards thrust, so you can't just jump over him, you'll have to jump and then time your dodges. Though again, there's no contact damage unless he's performing an attack from his charge, so it's not like it's a pain in the butt to deal with. And the story for him is actually pretty interesting. Now, while we don't have the full story details figured out yet, Shackled Beast isn't slacking on his end. Unlike the other bosses, he's not corrupted by the fumes, as he recognizes Nola as the Grim Reaper of Milius, someone less than savory in his eyes, and decides it's time for a fight against her. He's also a survivor of the Blight, which is interesting because the Tethered Steeple is by far the most connected to Ender Lilies in terms of plot so far, as the Blight was the source of the fumes causing the homunculi to go berserk, which I believe was brought about by Milius himself, or at the very least a lot of the experiments weren't helping things. And in the Shackled Beast size, he sees a lot of the attuners as no different from the homunculi, but after speaking with Frost, he decides to assist her, if only to kick the crap out of Milius, and he wants to see how far she'll go. Of course, back to the fight, when you get to his final phase, is my favorite in the entire game, partially due to the music, because how often are you going to hear a guitar in a Souls-like? Mechanically, the last phase has him chaining his attacks from his previous two phases together on top of a roar, which is designed to push you away but also telegraph his strongest attack, where the chains will rise from the ground, which isn't hard to dodge if you're paying attention, but it demands you respect it, as that attack can hit you for over 80 damage, which is more than half your health by this point in the game. After the fight resolves, though, he ends up recognizing Lilac is one of Frost's children and decides to help her out of respect for her family and what they've done. While we don't know the lengths to which Mother Dearest went in order to stop Millie, it's safe to assume that she went far enough to earn his respect, and I think he went far enough to earn the top spot on this list, at least until the full release of the game. And that's all for now. Magnolia is a fantastic game that has the potential to be one of my favorite Metroidvanias of all time. I enjoyed the first game a lot, and this one is a marked improvement over it. If you like Metroidvanias, I'd say give it a shot. Also, hot take, even if Silksong does end up coming out, it's never going to live up to the 6 years of expectations that I've amassed for it. Anyways, that's all for now, so if you like this video and want to see more, consider liking and subscribing. That's all I've got for now, and I'll see you all in the next video, whenever and whatever that may be. Take care.